Welcome to Product-Led Growth Leaders. We have an awesome guest on the show today who I met about a month ago or so at the Product-Led Go-to-Market conference out in San Francisco. She is kind of start from the background, did her undergrad in mathematics, cognitive science, fellow cognitive scientist, and computational linguistic. She back in the day studied neural networks long before LLMs became kind of a mainstay in all of our lives. Her background is as a statistician, a data scientist, and a data engineer. We're going to get a little bit of clarification on where to split the hairs between those. And she's worked in fintech and e-commerce and had started getting into the marketing side of things, applying her data skills to this area. And she has a passion for using data and applying data to things rather than just engineering it. And she's been a growth advisor for multiple different companies who are trying to figure out how to monetize better, how to reach their audiences better, and make better decisions, ultimately to grow. And today, she is the growth advisor for the company Strim and the director for growth marketing at Prefect, which is a data orchestration company. Sarah Bedell, thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure.
Awesome. So let's start with so where you're at now is Prefect. It's a product-led company. Help educate us on what makes a company like that product-led, in what sense is it the case that a company, and in your case, the company Prefect, is a product-led company?
Absolutely. So Prefect is a workflow orchestration tool. So it's meant for developers to take code, specifically Python code, and deploy it and manage it at scale. And so we help teams, specifically technical teams, manage their code more efficiently. So that's really the kind of the TLDR. As you can imagine, in the developer tooling space, we, like many others, have an open source product as well as various tiers in our cloud product that don't necessitate an annual agreement, for example. And so I would say by virtue of our setup and by virtue of having open source, that's kind of what makes us product led. So what I've seen in the kind of developer tooling space is very much companies that have an open source product. Usually people hear from them or try them out without the company ever knowing who they are or not knowing who they are for a very long time, right? Not even months, but could be years, in terms of that team or that person going to a different organization, whatever, being kind of ready to buy. So there's a lot of kicking the tires that happens on the product. So you also mentioned myself being a growth advisor to Stream. I'm very excited about their product, and it's they're also they're ramping up a PLG motion from being a little bit more enterprise focused before. But that company, for example, Stream, it's a change data capture product and a tool to move data around, either from databases or from applications to a data warehouse to various event streams. There's a lot of kind of data movement happening, basically. And Stream's case is that, the product motion is really around kicking the tires on the enterprise use case, as you can think about kind of how big that use case is for data movement. So I kind of gave an overview a little bit of two different approaches to how product led can happen, one with an open source, one with not.
Nice. Thanks for giving that extra context. And so, doing this through a growth team, let's start with what is, just for people who don't know, what is the goal of a growth team and how does that relate to PLG?
The goal of a growth team, as one could imagine, is to grow. But what does that mean? What are you growing, right, is the fundamental question. There's two. So as leading growth marketing at Prefect, I aim to grow one of two things. The first is our open source and product signups. And so that is really around product usage. And then the second is our leads for sales and that kind of more sales-assisted, sales-led motion. And so there's a very natural balance between those two, and you're really growing one of those two numbers. And for every company, that balance is going to be different of the percentage breakdown of where revenue falls, where efforts fall based on, the growth strategy.
Okay, so then, and thank you for that. And now thinking about a growth team, you've got the data folks largely at the core of that. Would you say that's the case? So data analysts, data scientists, and even machine learning engineers. Why, if that's the core of it, why do you think that ought to be the core of how we think about growth?
I think that growing efficiently is very important and knowing what levers you have to pull and how hard you need to pull them to kind of to grow those numbers as opposed to, for example, just throwing something at a wall and seeing what sticks or just kind of throwing money at the problem. And so data has to be at the core of it to do so efficiently. So if efficiency is not important to you, maybe it doesn't have to be. I would argue that it should be important to everyone, no matter the market conditions, right? But especially now. And so I would say that at a larger company, a lot of data teams report into growth teams. That isn't always the case for smaller companies because your data programs are being kind of set up from scratch. And a lot of those data programs are around not only around growth, but around kind of everything around the business, whether it's product usage, whether it's finance, et cetera.
So essentially, you can do it without that, but it would just be very wasteful. And like I said, you're kind of throwing things at the wall if you're not using actual data and linking what your strategies to reality. Um, so how do you think about growth in your own work? So the breakdown of growth marketing, growth product, growth analytics, how do those pieces properly come together?
Yeah, growth is a very complicated word because it can mean so many different things when you think about the team structure. And so I like kind of what you outlined between, right, growth marketing, growth product, and growth analytics. I would say that first and foremost, someone needs to be thinking about growth product, particularly at a PLG company. And those people can sit either, right, if you have a one all-encompassing growth team, that's one approach. Another approach is for growth to kind of be a part of other existing teams. So in the second case, right, there could be a product manager that is really interested and whose goal is to maximize product usage and the growth of the self-serve business, for example. That's how I would kind of think about growth product. As far as growth marketing, there I would say my role, for example, as director of growth marketing at Prefect is not necessarily growth of PLG. It's, as I mentioned, growth of both our product and our sales funnel. And so there's very much a split there. If I were to report, if there were a growth organization, for example, I would be more focused on the PLG motion if we were purely PLG. And then lastly, growth analytics. There's a lot of different podcasts and a lot of different trends on how to do a lot of testing and A/B testing, whether it's the website, whether it's growth experiments in the product. And so that the growth analytics portion, I think very much complements any test that you would do in growth marketing or growth product. But with the caveat that particularly at smaller companies, as they're ramping up, a lot of growth analytics are answering very basic questions even before you can run tests.
So that actually dovetails on a question that I wanted to pick your brain about, and that's the question of data versus theory. Now, so when I was in school and we're, being trained to be a researcher back in the day, we were taught that yes, you collect data, but you want things to be theory driven because that's how you know that you're not just finding random, just connecting the stars in the data. And we hear the terminology a lot in business. You want things to be data driven, and of course you do. So I guess the question is, in your opinion, what role does some type of theory play or should play in data analysis? There's some kind of top-down reasoning about things, or do you think that it's best to kind of have it be bottom up and say, here's what the data looks like, and apparently these are patterns, and we don't really care about making some kind of a framework for understanding it per se. It's just this is what it is, and let's act on it.
It's a really good question because I think you'll get a lot of different answers from a lot of different people to this question. But my perspective is really that I actually would kind of rename the theory word to context. I think context is incredibly important when thinking about data because data can show you something, but to understand why something is behaving the way it is, you need context and you need to understand the larger picture of kind of what is going on in the business. So I'll give an example where let's say you are tracking signups over time and you have a spike in one particular source of signups. Let's say it's from an event. You have to know that, right? Yes, there's a spike, but you also have to know that there was an event that marketing did. And if there wasn't, then there's a big question of why that spike happened. Was it people re-engaging? Was it something else? And so I think data is a very important way to figure out what questions to ask and how to think about the world and really kind of level and ground what is happening in actual numbers, but you have to accompany that with some sort of explanation that makes sense. And of course, that's where kind of the subjectivity kind of comes in.
Okay, so great. And so the context specifically might be just sort of facts that are realities that you want to link with the data. So we launched a marketing campaign on this date, and then that might have something to do with the next day us having a spike in the. So it's just being aware of extra factors. Would that be what we're calling context?
Yes, exactly. And I think there's an additional layer on top of this as well, which is, how much do you want data to drive your decisions versus how much do you want data to actually be part of the context that you then incorporate holistically to make a decision? And so those are two kind of very different approaches.
Okay, so I've heard you mention before about talking about the simplicity of choosing one's metrics and growing those metrics over time, starting off with something simple and then growing it over time. And I think you talked about it with respect to the phases of acquisition, activation, and monetization, that don't try to boil the ocean and do all this big thing, start with something simple. Could you flesh that out a little bit for us?
Absolutely. So when it comes to, for example, activation, right? We're talking about product usage. There are many different companies, many different large companies that run so many different little tests on what if I move some components around, make it a little easier to use, right? A lot of like incremental things. But those incremental things make a lot of sense when you're a company like Airbnb, for example, that already has, a lot of runway and a lot of usage and a lot of numbers to really validate that. But if you're for example, Series A or even a lot of the time Series B company, a lot of the questions that you might ask are very basic. So for example, what does activated mean? What are the handful, say, I don't know, somewhere between 3 to 5 steps that it takes the user to get there? And where are they dropping off? The way that I kind of like to, that's your product funnel. And the way that I like to think of a product funnel is in very simple terms, which is right in that drop off, there's a big gap. That means there's a big opportunity. And so it's as simple as that when you get started. Now, we just finished talking about context, right? So for example, let's say, in a lot of product signup experiences, there's an initial drop in the number of people that sign up versus do something very simple like tell you their name or name a workspace or something like that. A lot of the time, that gap might be quite large, but that's an intentional gap to filter out any sort of potential spam or bots or whatever. So it's never even quite as simple, but you have to start simple to then start asking the right questions, as opposed to, right, let's say we have a huge gap, but we're iterating on is component A above component B or vice versa, when really the question is there should be a component C that even isn't on the page, and that's what the user is struggling with. So that's like a very specific example for activation. And I think those same examples exist for both acquisition when it comes to where are people coming from, how many dollars are we putting into those sources, and how many people are actually showing up. And then on the monetization side, right, how are people converting? Is our pricing even the way that it should be? I don't think you see like Airbnb at their size isn't going to change pricing every month, right? But a much smaller company, that's something that you have to figure out to get right.
No, speaking of pricing, when we use products, freemium products, and we using the free version or just the standard thing that we're all familiar. Here's the free plan, the pro plan, the team plan, and you have the different features there. And I always think about, how great it would be to be an expert at telling a company, advising a company, how exactly do you've got 100 features, let's say, and how do you split them up and kind of, jigsaw them in the right pattern to where you're maximizing monetization? The kind of practice that you do, can it, to what extent does it lend insights to that kind of decision of where do you carve the line between the different levels of a subscription for a product?
So I'll answer this in two different ways. The first is if you look at data, what you're first going to see is, let's say your pricing is set up a certain way and you're assessing whether you should change it. What you're first going to see is a very skewed version of the world to the way that it's currently set up, which is certain people on a certain tier, they only start using certain features on a certain tier. Well, that's where context comes in. It's because you've limited that artificially, right? So there's certain artificial limits that you have to when you look at the data. However, what you can also say is, right, if you start with having a feature be available on all three tiers and assuming that you have different companies overall that are coming in at those different tiers, how much do different companies use that feature on those different tiers? If there are clear buckets in terms of the behavior, that might be something that is indicative of, okay, maybe we should incorporate that in pricing. However, there's always a flip side to these types of things. And the flip side is this very kind of meta question of how you tie certain pricing tiers with value that you give. For example, a lot of companies scale pricing based on collaboration and the number of people, right? What is the value of that is kind of the question. If you think of a company like Miro, the value scales very linearly, maybe even exponentially. But the point is there's a clear value connection with the number of people that you can share a diagram with, right? It's documentation that there's a very clear story there. And so that's kind of the broader question that I would think about when thinking about pricing.
So, so the first part of what you were saying seems to imply to me that, or raises the question, should a company start off offering everything so they could get good data about it? Because like you said, if people are only using this feature at the, it's artificially constrained because of what it's available. It almost, should there be some kind of a experimental phase where where you say, here's all the features, go ahead and use them, and then you see how people use the product, and then you say, okay, then you run the risk of saying, hey, guess what, now we're charging for these things that you love, and then people get mad. So a comment on that, and then I like what you mentioned about value and making sure that you're tying these things to value and not just splitting it up by, just seats or just coming up with something random, but making sure that it maps on a value.
Yeah, so on the first point, I will first caveat that this is very much a like customer success question, and that is not my area of expertise. So I'll comment,
Okay.
but with that caveat that of course, right, offering everything for free and then all of a sudden saying, okay, we're cracking down, now we're going to charge you is a terrible user experience. But there are kind of an in-betweens, right? You can run certain tests with existing customers of different sizes, with existing users of certain tiers, saying, are you interested in this? Maybe interviewing them or offering a feature in beta up to a certain usage level so you can see if people even hit that usage level. There's kind of a lot of different ways that you can experiment without setting yourself up for failure for a poor customer experience in the future. With that said, I think that there's also, right, we've been talking a lot about features and which features should go into certain pricing tiers. And you also, right, set yourself up to potentially have sales conversations that are like, okay, we're gonna, right. It's like you go to a, like a Japanese restaurant where they give you all the skewers and you kind of check the boxes of what you want, right? You don't want that to be the sales conversation because you don't really, you don't set yourself up to then have the value conversation down the line. So I will say that like, this is kind of what I'm seeing. I think pricing in general, I think is a very interesting topic. And I think how to set, there's a very important question of how to set yourself up to have very valuable sales conversations, which is not quite my area of expertise, but that setting up in terms of user experience and in terms of understanding, that's kind of where I concentrate.
Great. So, in terms of the growth person's uh, job, I've heard you say that growth is all about finding the opportunities. In the practice of a job, what does that look like? Does it look like, here's what we see in terms of usage patterns? We believe that if we double down on X feature, then we should be able to get things. Like, how does that come together? A growth person finding opportunities and that being a core value of the job role.
I think it really comes down to the funnel. I like to think of an entire company's process from awareness all the way to final annual deal as one funnel, as opposed to multiple funnels. Sure, they're multiple pieces, but it's one funnel. And so I think a growth person's job is to really understand what that funnel looks like end to end, how long it takes for someone to get through that funnel, what help they might need to get through that funnel, and how we can reduce friction for the right person to get through that funnel. So for the right person is the very important word here. So for example, you're not going to have a seed startup go to all the way, right? Signing an annual deal and being your biggest customer, right? So the right person, it has to be the right person, but it's figuring out what does that funnel look like and where are the big opportunities? Where are the drop-off points? Once you identify those, right? So first you have to identify the problem. That's all in identifying the problem. Then you have to switch into solution mode of, okay, how can we fix those things? And then that gets into, I would say later stage companies are more in the solution phase in terms of we know where drop-offs are happening. How do we fix it? And that's really the question, right? And that's where the room for experimentation comes in to ideate and to run different experiments, to run A/B tests on improving a particular metric and a particular piece of the funnel.
Now, being from the UX side of things, I'm constantly thinking about the user's journey and how you can make things better along the way. And we do usability research. To what degree do you think, or do you today, have the growth team interact with the design team and the researchers and designers on that side of things? Is there any kind of synergy there, or do you wish there was, but you often don't realistically get time to? What does that look like for you?
Yeah, I would say at a lot of earlier companies, there's one, maybe two designers, and so they're very like, horizontal across the org, and so growth very much interacts with them as part of kind of their view across everything, whether it's the design of the marketing website, the product, the documentation, whatever it might be. I would say at a later org, a lot of growth teams, right, as part of growth product have a design, whether it's a design person, whether it's a product manager with a knack for design. But I think design is very important because in the example that I mentioned previously, where you need to, if you're talking about whether component one or component A or component B is on top, you also need to understand whether component C has a place on the page. And so that's where I think product and design very much overlap.
Nice. Now, I find that a lot of people in business and otherwise have a kind of a cynical relationship with data. People start off with a conclusion and they seek to try to prove it. And like on the science side of things, you're kind of taught to, have an idea of what you're trying to demonstrate or prove against, and then find data and see what side is supported. How do you deal with citing data in your practice? When you have a finding, does it internally get like published and then you cite it again and again, or is it just everyone's so busy that you say, hey, we ran this test, look at this data sheet over here, this is what we found, and I'm making some recommendations based upon stuff that I found. How do you deal with the citability of data and kind of the knowledge management?
There's a joke that my dad, who's an engineer, tells, which is it's a very short joke, and it goes something like this. There are lies and then there's statistics. And so you really have to keep in mind when you look at data, like what data integrity looks like. And what I usually like to do as best practice is, you say that what is the takeaway, you show the chart, but then there's a whole little paragraph section about this was the sample size, this is the cohort, right? This is the background of what kind of goes into this to show kind of what the integrity of the finding looks like. Now, this is one of the reasons that I believe there is a lot of value in analytics teams being separate from their individual units. So I don't think that an entire analytics team should roll up into sales, into marketing, into product, whatever it might be, because there's a bias, right? Sales wants to optimize revenue, product wants to optimize product usage. And so there's a way to kind of show things usually there's a way to show things the way that you want them to occur. If an analytics team is just optimized for growth or is broadly, right, isn't necessarily super invested in a particular functional area, but they're kind of more neutral, they have this more horizontal view of the business, which I think is incredibly valuable for data integrity. So that is kind of one way that I've seen that approached.
Nice. And finally, what is data orchestration and how does Prefect help people do it better?
Data orchestration is the practice of getting any data pipeline from your computer into the cloud and run when you want it to run and where you want it to be run. So Prefect helps people do that by being a one-stop shop for not only scheduling code, but also allowing you to trigger it anytime you want via an API and monitor all of that code at once. So you have a true understanding and appreciation for when that code is not doing the thing you want it to be doing. So
Nice.
definitely encourage anyone to try out Prefect, especially if you code.
Nice. Sarah, where can people find you and keep up with what you're doing and thinking about?
Yeah, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, so do find me there. I am also on Twitter. I also have a Substack. It's Sarah's newsletter, .substack.com. So those are kind of the three places where you can hear more from me.
Nice. Sarah Bedell, thank you for being with us today.
Thanks so much, Thomas.